Hi, Rod. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Thanks very much for having me on again.
A beautiful sunny day this week as well. So November's still holding up actually in terms of the old temperatures. We're focusing on, which is probably relevant actually, we're focusing upon psychology this week, and the two articles that you've written in Elephants in the Room about the essence of psychology, and in terms of, explaining the psychology behind the non-questioning of sociopathic abuses of power. So it might sound complicated, but actually it's a fascinating read, a fascinating listen, and over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Yeah, so I started to realize when I was sort of writing all of my sort of material that if we're not studying psychology, then we're never really going to understand what's going on. And so I started to research it in more depth, and I realized there are a handful of really important things that psychologists have identified in the last century or so, which explain to some extent why it is that ordinary people are so easily misled by propaganda and why whole populations can come to tolerate war crimes by their governments. So I like to begin with a quote, and there's an excellent one by Carl Sagan, the philosopher, who was very popular on television a few decades ago. And he said, "One of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It's simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. Once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back." And I think that's a very good summary of how sort of psychology works in relation to propaganda. So we're going to look at 4 or 5 sort of main ideas, which together sort of explain what's going on. And one of the most important of those is what some people call willful blindness. Other people use terms like self-deception or denial. And there was an outstanding book written by a man called Stanley Cohen called States of Denial, which looked at how it is that whole nations of people can come to deny the crimes of their governments. So he starts initially by looking at how the German people come to tolerate the crimes of the German government during the Second World War. But then he broadens it out to say, look, let's look at what our governments, the British and American governments, are doing, particularly overseas. They're doing monstrous crimes. But the vast majority of people, many journalists, sort of pretend that they have no knowledge of this. He came up with the expression simultaneously knowing and not knowing. So we all have some evidence of what's really going on. We've all seen something that makes us go, actually, this seems a bit dubious. I should be questioning this. But actually, we're so uncomfortable about discovering the truth that, in fact, we don't go looking for the evidence that would confirm what is probably true. So we try to deny knowledge of things that make us uncomfortable, and we turn away from examining these things. So we have to remember that all of us are bombarded with propaganda every day of our lives, pretty much from the moment we are born. And this tends to condition us to think in a certain way. We buy into the way most of our mainstream systems work. So we buy into the economic system, the military system, and the political system. So most people are not aware that this information they're being presented with is distorting their understanding of the world every day. So over time, we develop a set of ideas about how the world works. And one of the things that psychologists have identified is a very, very powerful psychological trait called confirmation bias. This means we prefer information that makes us feel good about ourselves. Usually it means we prefer information that confirms our existing points of view. If we come across evidence that strongly contradicts our existing beliefs, we feel very, very uncomfortable. And so confirmation bias is sometimes broken down into 3 parts. So the first of those is called biased search. Now, in fact, most people will be aware of this. Most people read a particular newspaper, if they read a mainstream newspaper at all, because they know the opinions in there are similar to their own. So left-wing people tend not to buy the Telegraph and so on. So because we like reading newspapers and we like reading other material that confirms our existing point of view, it makes us feel good about ourselves. The next stage in the bias is called biased interpretation. Now, I have a personal experience of this where my brother and I disagreed about something, and we sat and watched a documentary about that topic. Now, as the documentary was finishing, I was sitting there feeling quite smug about myself, thinking, ha ha, that documentary confirmed what I believed. But before I had a chance to say anything, my brother went, ha ha, you see, I was right. And we couldn't understand how it was that we both sat and watched the same documentary, but each of us had taken from it the evidence that supported our existing beliefs. So this is really important, that what we tend to do is look for little nuggets of information that support what we believe. And then if there's evidence that doesn't agree with what we believe, we tend to sort of dismiss that or say, well, I don't think that's very important, or it doesn't come from a good source. And various bits of research have shown that if you present neutral information to people, they will tend to find ways to interpret it as supporting their existing beliefs. And the final element of bias is called biased memory, where we tend to remember things that are consistent with our existing beliefs, and we will tend to forget information that contradicts our beliefs. Now, there's been a few explanations or attempts at explanations as to why these might be happening. And some psychologists have suggested that actually most people are not really very good at remembering detail. We remember a sort of overall framework of how the system works, of how we think about the world. If new information fits into that framework, we're very receptive to it. It slots in easily. If information comes along that doesn't fit inside that framework, we don't really know what to do with it, because in order to fit that in, we'd have to sort of dismantle the framework and come up with a new understanding of the world. So we tend to sort of dismiss it because it doesn't fit in. So what we realize is that people will continue to believe things even when they are strongly contradicted by the evidence. And so this is something that affects all of us, even me. None of us is immune from these psychological traits. We all have our biases. So there are various other things related to this type of thing. So the next psychological trait that's been identified by psychologists is something called obedience, or destructive obedience. Now, there were some very famous experiments that were first carried out by a researcher called Stanley Milgram back in 1963, where subjects believed they were giving electric shocks to other people, and they were following orders to give electric shocks. And it turned out that when people are following orders, they will even give lethal electric shocks to people. And in fact, there's been various pieces of research that have confirmed this in the real world. So in fact, when nurses are following the orders of doctors, they will do so even when those orders might lead to the death of a patient. So people are very, very reluctant to question orders from their superiors. It's as if we pass on our sort of ethical responsibility onto someone else and forget all about it when we're being obedient. It's actually thought that approximately a quarter of plane crashes are caused by people being obedient in a very destructive way. And there is even a famous historical example of two battleships crashing into each other because none of the sailors questioned their orders. In fact, the soldiers could see that the battleships were going to crash, but they still carried on following their orders, and the ships crashed. So we can see this in a real world scenario where we have cost cutting in many industries, which are known to lead to dangers. And so the famous Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and there was a very big fire on the Deepwater Horizon, which killed people, that came about because of cost cutting. And lots of people knew that the cost cutting was causing danger, but they went ahead and did it anyway. Similarly, at the Texas City oil refinery, where there was a huge fire and people died, again, that was because of cost cutting. People knew that safety measures were not adequate, but they went ahead and did cut the safety measures anyway. So the next psychological trait that appears to be extremely powerful in influencing our behavior is what's known as conformity. Now, this was a famous experiment that began with a researcher called Solomon Asch back in 1951. And the idea was a subject in a research experiment would have to count the number of times that a bell chimed. Now, what the subject didn't know was that everyone else in the room was in on the experiment. So let's just say that the bell chimes 9 times. Everyone else in the room who's pretending to be a subject is asked how many times did it chime, and they each say it chimed 10 times. And you then get to the subject of the experiment and you see, does that person say 9 or do they say 10? And nearly always people say 10. They want to fit in with what everybody else has said. Even if you ask them afterwards, they'll say, what did you count? They say, well, I counted 9. I'm sure it was 9, but I wanted to fit in, so I said 10. So it turns out that isolation for human beings is very, very uncomfortable. In fact, it's worse than being wrong, basically. And in fact, they've done research where they do this type of thing, but they scan people's brains at the same time. And they're getting to the point where they think that with some people, this fitting in can even sometimes be subconscious. That is, they're so keen to fit in, they're not actually aware of the correct number of chimes at all, which I think is a fascinating insight, that some of these psychological traits are so powerful, some individuals may not even be aware that they're operating at all. So these types of things explain a number of effects that we see in the real world. So one thing that's been identified in various pieces of research is called groupthink. Whereas if you put a group of people together to discuss a topic and come up with a policy, if nobody challenges the mainstream view that's being discussed, then in fact you get what's sometimes called polarization. You get very extreme views being agreed and very extreme policies being agreed. But it only takes one person in a group to challenge the dominant narrative that gives other people the confidence to step forward and say, oh, yes, I was having doubts about that too, and perhaps we should consider these alternatives. But if nobody says something to challenge the main narrative, then people are so keen to fit in with everybody else around them that they won't challenge the views that are being created, even if they personally don't agree with them. And we see evidence that ethical standards decrease in groups. So, for example, there's various bits of research showing that doctors will not blow the whistle on colleagues who are dangerous. And financiers have said, this was particularly in the run-up to the financial crisis in 2008, that if everyone around them is doing something that they think is unethical, then perhaps it's okay for them to do unethical things. They start to question what is normal, what is acceptable. And so the law, instead of being something that we must not do, it ends up becoming an obstacle to be circumvented. So it seems fairly clear that a combination of obedience and conformity is actually a very dangerous combination. And we find those two operating together in many organizations, many companies, and many government organizations. So staff want to obey their superiors and they want to fit in. And in fact, in previous weeks, you've asked me about hierarchical structures. And I think the way we have such strong hierarchies in Britain and also in America is actually one element that causes people to be so obedient and so unquestioning of the instructions they're given. And we do need to think very carefully about ways to deal with this. So various people in various fields have said if lots of other people share an idea, then it comes to seem normal. And so anybody can be, almost anybody can be brought to believe something if lots and lots of other people also believe it. It's very, very difficult to challenge the group. So if you look at discussions about the financial world prior to 2008 and the financial crisis, in fact, hardly anyone was challenging the financial system. There were a handful of people, but it was very, very small minority. Everybody just bought into the status quo. And the other thing is that once an opinion is strongly formed, it becomes extremely difficult to change that opinion. And we see this with journalists and with academics, that they've been saying the same thing for many years, and it becomes incredibly difficult to challenge them and to get them to stop and think about the evidence sort of objectively, and to challenge their existing views. Because to challenge their views is actually, they take it as a sort of personal insult, and they find that very difficult to cope with. Okay, so those are the sort of the inbuilt traits that that affect how people operate, and they're quite difficult to overcome. You know, they're so deep-rooted, it is extremely difficult to overcome those. Now, we're going to talk about a number of other areas that are perhaps less difficult to overcome, but still they play an important role in modern societies. So the first thing is about power. And there's lots and lots of evidence that power corrupts people. Now, I often say this, that to me, power corrupts is one of the most important expressions in all of human history. We see it everywhere where people have too much power, and it corrupts their decision-making in business and in government. So there's lots of research showing that when you give people power, they become too confident. They essentially become delusional. They start to believe that they're more capable of solving problems than they actually are. But we also see other things happening when people have too much power. So the research suggests that they lie more often, that they're more assertive, but they're less able to see the world from somebody else's point of view. They're less inclined to challenge the received wisdom, and a sort of huge range of kind of variations on those things. So it's not just that power corrupts, but it corrupts in extremely complex ways that we're only really just beginning to understand. Now, connected to power is money, and money is a sort of form of power, if you like. And money seems to motivate our interest in ourselves, and it seems to make us selfish. So there's been some fantastic research that people have sort of spotted over the years about what happens when you introduce money into a system where money was not part of the system before. So, for example, in Britain, many people are blood donors. They give blood voluntarily because they know it's important for our societies and the functioning of the healthcare system. And they don't expect to be paid for it. They do it without any payment. Now, economists thought that if you pay blood donors some money for donating blood, then the people who currently give blood would continue to do so, but the money would motivate more people to also become blood donors. But in fact, that doesn't happen. Once you start paying people for blood donations, the people who do it already out of a belief that it's the right thing to do, they tend to stop doing it, and they become replaced by people who need the money. So in fact, what you end up with is getting blood donations from a proportion of the population who are actually less healthy. It's people like drug addicts and so on who want to give blood. So in fact, there seems to be a trade-off between the financial motivation and the existing social motivation, which is completely the opposite of what mainstream economists used to believe. They thought that these motivations would add together, but in fact they don't. One seems to displace the other. And in fact, there was similar research showing the same thing about collecting children from daycare. So if you look at a daycare center and they say you have to pick your child up every day at 3:30 in the afternoon. The vast majority of parents will get to the daycare center on time to pick their children up. Most people recognize they have a social obligation to try and be on time. So some daycare centers tried introducing fines to penalize people who were late, thinking that this would decrease the number of people who were occasionally late to pick up their children. In fact, once you start fining people for being late, the lateness increases. People cease to have the social obligation and they see it as a sort of financial trade-off. And so they are late more often. So it's interesting that money has very significant social consequences, often unintended, but they affect the way we think about society, about our relationship with each other, and about social obligations. And so we need to start to take this into account when we start talking about all sorts of aspects of our society, where at the moment there's a tendency to make everything into a financial transaction. And I think that could be quite harmful to our societies. So I came across a couple more quotes that are from quite a long time ago. So a couple of writers, Upton Sinclair in 1934, and then another philosopher called Edmund Burke. There's two separate quotes. They're very similar. One of them said, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." And the other one was, "All that evil needs to flourish is for good people to see nothing and get paid for it." And so both of these people are saying that actually being paid to think in a certain way is not necessarily a good idea. And we see this particularly with journalists. They understand, once they've been doing the job for long enough, that their career, their high pay, and so on is very dependent on them not saying certain things, not being too critical of the establishment and of various structures of power. Okay, so the last area that I want to look at is a sort of combination of what we call distance and complexity. So the idea is people don't really see things that are too far away. So if we look at the earlier obedience experiments that we mentioned, where people were giving electric shocks, or they believed they were giving electric shocks. In practice, they weren't actually giving electric shocks. I should point that out. But it turned out that your proximity to the person you believed you were electrocuting made a difference. If they were in a different room, people were very comfortable giving electric shocks. If they were right there in front of you, then people become much less comfortable giving electric shocks. So distance or proximity is a very, very important element of how our psychological systems work. Well, we've actually created systems in government and in big companies where senior people operate in a sort of bubble of power. They're completely cut off from the end results of their decision making. They're sort of sealed off from bad news, they're sealed off from hostile opinions, and they see no evidence to contradict their decisions, because on the whole, they tend to surround themselves with people who will share their decisions. And we see this in Britain in what we call the Westminster bubble, with politicians and leading journalists who form a sort of small group who all share very similar points of view, and they're sort of insulated from the evidence of the harmful effects of their decisions and so on. So very few journalists, for example, work at food banks or at homeless shelters. They just don't see the downsides of what is actually going on in the world. And the same, of course, with most politicians. So we've created a system where if you look at, say, our financial system, it became very clear during the 2008 financial crisis that the complexity of our financial system is completely unmanageable. Nobody in any of the biggest banks really has any idea what all of the different parts of their banks are doing. They're just far too big. No one can possibly understand every part of them. And unfortunately, when you build these complex systems, not only do you create distance in relation to senior managers not being able to see the outcomes of their decisions, but you also create sort of complexity in relation to who is responsible for what. So responsibility becomes diffused. So no one thinks they are responsible for any specific thing. So you can see this on a day-to-day level with, say, outsourcing. So your local council provides, let's say, rubbish collections, but they've outsourced it to a private company who are supposed to be responsible for your rubbish collections. But when there's a problem, you don't know who to call. If you call the private company, they'll say call the council. If you call the council, they'll say call the private company. And in fact, there's a deliberate aspect to outsourcing, which is to hand off responsibility and to be able to blame someone else when things start to go wrong. Now, one of the things I do want to stress with all that I've talked about in relation to this psychological things is that it has nothing to do with intelligence. So the people who believe they are the most intelligent, people with PhDs or master's degrees, or who believe they are experts in a particular field, they are at least as susceptible as everyone else to the various psychological traits that I've talked about. And in fact, with some of these traits, probably the more focused you are on some particular sort of speciality, so perhaps you're an academic who's an economist, the more difficult it becomes to change your views on something that you might have taught for decades. And the same with journalists who think they're experts on a particular topic. If they've written the mainstream version of events for decades, it becomes incredibly difficult for them to change what they write. They're basically admitting that everything they've said for the whole of their life might be wrong, and they really don't want to admit to that. So in fact, often people who believe they're more intelligent and have higher degrees and so on, in certain areas, the psychological traits work harder to make them less able to question the status quo and to question their views and to look at the evidence a little bit more objectively. So if we look at how we might think about solving these things, the first thing that I want to say is that the existing arrangements are pretty much wrong in every regard. So if you look at companies and governments, they are very big, very complex, very hierarchical. Questioning your bosses and questioning the status quo is discouraged. There's a great deal of groupthink. Conformity is rewarded. Ethics pretty much go out of the window because the focus is on profit a lot of the time, and nobody really feels they personally have responsibility for anything. And if we look at what is happening at the moment, corporate lawyers and financiers are actually trying to do the wrong thing. They're trying to make these organizations bigger, more complex, less transparent and less accountable. So you have layer upon layer of shell companies in tax havens and holding companies and subsidiaries. So the complexity increases and transparency decreases, and it becomes harder and harder for any human being to have any way of understanding what's really going on and holding these organizations to account. But this complexity creates more risk, and it concentrates ever more power in fewer hands. So all of this is the wrong direction that our society should be heading if we want to take psychology seriously and trying to make society a better place. So we have to think about what we can do in the future. And so if we were to take these things into account, let's say you're talking about power. Well, there are ways to reduce the power that any one person or any organization has. And you can reduce complexity. So if you look at the biggest organizations, let's say the biggest banks, even insiders in the system at the Bank of England has said there's absolutely no reason why we can't break up all of the biggest banks. So they're much smaller. And there's no reason why we can't separate different parts of the banking system. So the part that we want to be very safe and secure, so loans, mortgages, savings, and so on, are completely separate from what we might call the gambling part of banking, which is complex instruments on the financial markets like derivatives and so on. That could be entirely separate, and we could shrink that side of the system down. But the people who make money from the system don't want us to do these things. By making things smaller, we can move decision makers closer to their outcomes. We can make everybody more accountable. We can have better systems in place. to scrutinize what's going on. We can remove the financial incentives. This is something that I want to spend a couple of minutes focusing on, actually, in that a lot of people in business, and this is taught in business schools, they love the idea of performance-related pay, that an executive will earn more if the share price of the company goes up. But actually what we're seeing in the real world is that motivates that motivates executives to do unethical things. It motivates them to rip off suppliers. It motivates them to try to fire and rehire all their staff. It motivates them to try and rip off customers by having really complex plans on, say, mobile phones or something like that, which makes it hard to compare with other companies. But it also motivates them to come up with these ever more complex systems to hide profit in tax havens so they avoid paying tax. And it motivates them to do more and more lobbying of the government to try and get more subsidies. And it motivates them to use the resources of the environment in a way where they pay no costs and they pollute without paying the costs. And if you look at a specific example, so the company Trafigura was dumping toxic waste off the coast of Africa. All of this is motivated by executives trying to get a bigger pay packet by not paying the costs of dealing with their waste products. So in fact, performance-related pay is something we really need to scrutinize carefully, because it actually motivates people to do all the wrong things. So some of the things we talked about there in the second half, so the distance, the power, the money, the complexity, those are things we can work on reducing. The things I talked about in the first half, the conformity, the confirmation bias, these are kind of hardwired. It's incredibly difficult to challenge them, but we could make a sort of dent in them, I think, by changing the way we educate people. So we have to build questioning into the whole education system so that everybody who, when they become an adult, automatically questions everything. We want to encourage people to examine all sorts of alternative ideas, never ever sort of dismiss a set of ideas as being unacceptable. We have to look at them and we have to keep re-examining them and keep asking the question, are they relevant now, and so on. So we need to encourage freedom of expression, much, much broader debates, much more critical debates. But as well as this, it's also important to ensure that young people, as they grow up, have what you might call values, that actually people understand the importance of ethics, that you can't just create a giant company whose only goal is to make more and more profit, irrespective of the harms it causes to society. So in fact, all of these organizations and groups of people need to be operating within an overall ethical framework. And that would require that a whole generation of people grows up thinking about what's important in life completely differently from the current generation, most of whom have been sort of brainwashed to think in terms only of how much money have you got. So if we're looking, say, at the media, we need to minimize the ability of people with power to manipulate us. So that's governments and companies controlling the media and controlling all the messages that we receive. So we need to find more and more ways to bypass the propaganda that comes from the mainstream media. And of course, that's one of the things that we're trying to do today. And somebody once said, another philosopher once said, that we will know that we are making progress when our societies celebrate conscientious objectors more than soldiers, and when we celebrate whistleblowers instead of punishing them. So I think that's probably a good place to end the presentation and open it up to Q&A.
Amazing, Rod. Absolutely amazing. It's hard to know where to start, but where I am going to start is when you talked about when you sat down with your brother and you watched a documentary, because you both initially come from opposing positions, and you then both watched the video, and like you said, you thought that, okay, you've nailed it, you've won this argument. And then he preempted you by obviously saying that he won the argument from what he'd extracted. what that does really, really challenge is the philosophical existence of truth. Because if we can both look at the same thing and extract very different things from it, does truth exist within it?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's a really complex sort of question to answer. So, interestingly enough, when people who share my views have conversations with journalists, and they say, you know, look at British and American war crimes and so on, often the stock response of a journalist is to say, that's just your opinion. And so, to some extent, there's an element of truth in that. But the world, I don't believe, is only about opinions, because there is such a thing as evidence. And I think on many topics, if you all sit down together and carefully go through the evidence, then I think you can draw a conclusion that many, many people would agree with. But I think that becomes harder and harder as the people you're trying to form agreement with already have strongly held views, if that makes sense. So I think
Yes.
you could take, let's say, 1 million 18-year-olds who know nothing about a topic, present the evidence to them, and I think quite a lot of them would end up coming up with similar-ish views. Whereas I think if you start talking with 30, 40, 50-year-olds, much of the time they already have an opinion based on their life experience, then I think it becomes a little harder to come up with an agreement. So I think that the term truth is an elusive concept, yes. And it's hard to set it down concretely, but I think you can get close to the truth much of the time.
Yes, no, yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is such a complex thing that it isn't necessarily something that I wanted to engage in at a philosophical or an epistemological level. It's just something that I wanted to ask, because two people that come away from the same thing with such diverse perspectives, it opens up the argument, doesn't it, very much so, about the nature of subjectivity across all of society and across all of our understanding. To give you an example, if you go into the criminal justice system and you're put in the dock, you're very much dependent in terms of the outcome of the trial as to the quality of your legal representation and of the quality of the evidence that is put in front of the jury. So effectively, you can manufacture an outcome within criminal justice based on the fact that your legal representation may be absolutely top-notch, or they may be absolutely dreadful. Or the prosecution may follow that same, although the prosecution is usually employed by the state. So they are more likely to have a higher quality. And then, of course, it's down to the evidence that's put in front of the jury and how much evidence is being able to acquired. And then, obviously, the subjectivity in relation to the jury. And then it comes back to try to finish off this key of what you said earlier. If you've got 12 people on the jury, how many of them are going with the flow? So we've got the group dynamics there. So if we're saying that there is no such thing as absolute truth, then our criminal justice system is in itself ultimately flawed from the start.
So I would agree. I think there are always going to be flaws in any criminal justice system, because it's really hard for anybody who sort of wasn't there at the event witnessing it, yes, to really know what actually happened. And this is obviously, this is one of the interesting things in cases relating to sexual assault, where it comes down to one person's word against another person's word and so on. And oddly enough, on a very trivial level, I find the justice system very, very irritating, in that I have contested a number of fixed penalty notices in relation to traffic offences, where I am firmly convinced that any ordinary person would say, I have done nothing wrong. And in fact, I've even been to arbitration where the person doing the arbitration has said, well, obviously nobody thinks you've done anything wrong, but I'm still going to fine you. And I find that very, very irritating, that the way the legal system is structured can end up working in this way. And so what you're saying about how 12 members of a jury, some of them will think one thing, some of them will think another thing. All of them are bringing into the courtroom their life experience. And it is impossible to separate their decision-making process in relation to the evidence and so on from their life experience. And you just know that a lot of the time you feel that some people, whether it be judges or whether it be jurors, are looking at a defendant thinking, well, he's a wrong one. And you realize that, as you say, that it's incredibly difficult to come up with a legal justice system that has very few flaws. It's always going to have some flaws. And the question is how you minimize these. And I think we've sort of done what most people would think is probably a reasonable thing over the years by insisting on this basic concept, which people often phrase as better that 100 guilty men go free rather than a single innocent person be locked up. And I quite like that concept, but I know I meet individuals who say, well, that's ridiculous. We're just letting all these people walk away. We have to kind of change the balance. And of course, the balance would, if that would change, would mean more innocent people being locked up, which I think would be a terrible thing. So in that sense, I think efforts have been made over the years to try to sort of balance it in a reasonable, and they're attempting to balance it in a way which puts the onus very firmly on the prosecution, but still it's always going to be an imperfect system.
Yes. And I think it's probably a brilliant example that encapsulates a lot of what you talked about today, and that is the Nuremberg trials. And I don't know how much you know about the Nuremberg trials, but in essence, there was a lot of conflict that went on to determine the parameters. Obviously, between the Americans, the Russians, the British, and the French, they were the main protagonists, if you like. And they wanted different things. The Americans wanted a process that was in an open court because they felt that that's what the American people wanted to see, so that everything was out there. The Russians wanted a show trial, so effectively it was just a staged event in which they'd already decided the guilt. Churchill, although obviously he was voted out in the summer of 45 anyway, and Clement Attlee came in, but Churchill initially just wanted to line all the Nazis up and shoot them. And the French had a different system because they have a system where the judge also operates as the chief investigator. And so until you actually get into the courtroom and you have your own legal representatives, the judge has collated the evidence. So you can imagine that there's a really confusing process going on here in terms of deciding the parameters. But effectively what they did in the end, Rod, was just to choose the top people in the Nazi regime to put on trial. Because, and this is really important in terms of what you've been saying today, the other ones were effectively just saying, we were just following orders. And to support that, every single person who served in the Nazi regime, certainly in the army, carried around a booklet that told them that they were not to go along with unlawful orders. So that effectively got a lot of them off the hook. And it comes on to Milgram in a minute. So what we're effectively saying here is that these people had no, and I mean no, free will, because if your argument is they had at least partial free will, they should have been put on trial.
Well, that's a really complex argument. You obviously know a lot more about those trials than I do. And I'd have to go away and do sort of a lot of research and think about the points you're making before I could say anything that that would really sort of inform any of the listeners. And so my research into the Nuremberg trials and also the Tokyo trials is less detailed, but there were some very important points that I think are possibly worth mentioning. They're not so specific to psychology, but they're probably worth mentioning at this point. In that, in the Nuremberg trials, there was a desire by some prosecutors to prosecute more defendants, but various people said, hang on a minute, we're only doing what the British and the Americans are doing. And so to avoid that discussion, they didn't prosecute some of those people. But then something perhaps that's more related to psychology with the Tokyo Tribunal was this was where the Japanese leaders were prosecuted after World War II. And I believe there were 7 jurors from different countries. And 7 of them, so 11 jurors from different countries, 7 of them found the Japanese leadership guilty. 4 of them said not guilty. And one of the dissenting opinions was an Indian judge who said, well, how can we possibly think the Japanese did anything wrong? A lot of people in India would have welcomed them to replace the British. And I think that's fascinating in terms of saying that actually this kind of thing that we were saying earlier, that you cannot separate the legal decision-making process from your life experience and what you bring into the courtroom and so on. And so, yeah, I think probably we could, if we did enough research, we could debate Nuremberg and Tokyo all day, and it has fascinating insights for not only psychology, but also concepts such as power, how the law actually works in relation to powerful people and so on. And
also because I think that they wanted to get the trial underway. It was 1946 when they actually, the trial actually began. But they wanted to get the trial underway, and I think the arguments also surrounded burden of proof, because if they were starting to bring in many others, it's possible that the trial wouldn't have even taken place in the 50s. It would have had to have waited so long, and they wanted it over and done with. So obviously that decision was made. But also ties into Milgram, because you talk about obviously people being in another room and not seeing the results of their actions. They're believing, and that one of the reasons they believed, if I'm right, is because when they pressed the button and it was a high voltage, the actor in the other room made a loud scream.
That's my understanding too, yes.
Yes, so they could hear it, but they couldn't see it.
Yeah.
So in terms of understanding psychology, it's also about looking at the senses. What is it about what we see and what we hear that's so differential that changes our behavior?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And I think the thing with psychology, it's like a number of topics that we touch upon in different weeks, is that what we sort of realize is that our understanding of these things is still at an incredibly superficial level. And in a couple of 100 years' time, we may have a much better understanding. But at the moment, my understanding is people don't really understand in any meaningful sense what it is about the different senses that would impact us in a different way. We have a general understanding that visual things really can make an impact with us. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I've come across any serious scientific research.
No. When we talk about the process by which we have this confirmation bias, and we only go looking for evidence that supports our pre-existing prejudices or understandings, isn't there also psychologically that inherent, perhaps not inherent, I don't know, perhaps it's purely learned, that we fear looking wrong in public?
Yes.
So whether it's social media or whether it's face-to-face, we don't want, don't get me wrong, I do come across people quite a lot who hold their hands up straight away and say, I'm mistaken. But they are by far in the minority compared to those people that continue to compound their inaccuracies.
Yeah, I think you're right that people really don't want to admit they've been wrong, and that ties in a little bit, I think, with some of the traits that we were talking about. That the longer somebody has believed something or taught it, and the more strongly they hold certain views, the more resistant they are to admitting that they're wrong. And so, yes, there's each of the sort of traits I've talked about. If you sort of go along and look at the psychological research, then they can start breaking them down into a dozen different subcomponents and start saying, look, let's analyze that in detail. Let's analyze this in detail. And in fact, there are loads and loads of aspects of our psychology that make us quite easy to manipulate, which I find really, really fascinating. And in fact, various people have been trying to write about this type of thing in relation to what's been going on over the last 2 years in relation to the coronavirus. And in terms of the fact that we know the government has sat down with its nudge unit, the psychologists who are there to advise on how to manipulate the population. And they've said, look, you've got to make them afraid. You've got to use fear and so on. That actually various people are now coming forward and saying, well, look, this is why so many people have not questioned the mainstream narrative, and they go through all these different psychological traits. And people really want the system to sort of work, and they want their government to be good people and doing the right thing. And if any of these things are not sort of there in their lives, it makes them feel very uncomfortable. So there are quite a lot of elements to this. So for people who are interested, I mean, the amount of research you can do on this is absolutely endless. So I tend to sort of keep it down just to a fairly narrow, just nice overview, and just say, listen, we need to understand this. We really do.
Yes, and I think taking the COVID example and bringing it into the era of the vaccine, I think is also really, really important, because it's possible that the government could sit down with their nudge units in order to create a scenario where the vast majority will take the vaccine. Forget anything sinister pushed forward by certain people or whatever. But it could be that they purely understand that we will resist the vaccine, even though epidemiologically, scientifically, the belief is that the vaccine is good for us. It will eventually, as a society and as individuals, be much more protective. But they're still using the nudge unit to find psychological strategies to get the vast majority of people on side to take it.
So my own view is that the evidence on the virus is very complex. And so when you're saying that epidemiologically we need to be taking the vaccines, to me, that's a hypothetical situation. You could be in that situation and still you would need the nudge unit to persuade people to do it. I actually think those people who are resistant to the vaccines at the moment are doing so with very good reason. But it would take a whole show to do that. And we may have to wait a few months before we do that discussion.
Yeah. I wasn't trying to take a side. I was just trying to see it from the government's perspective. If, for example, the government and all the people around them in the medical profession genuinely believe that this vaccine, it's better that we have it than we don't, whether we're talking short, long-term, medium-term effects is another issue. But at this point in time, they argue that the vaccine is better. It may well be that they need to have to use the nudge unit to get the compliance, even though. So I'm not making a judgment on the vaccine. All I'm saying is that if it's possible that governments may be doing things for the right reasons, and I'm not suggesting that ours is. I'm just saying that it may be, but they still have to use nudge units in order to be persuasive, and they have to use those psychological strategies, because otherwise the population might defy them, and a worse outcome be delivered.
So I think that's a really complex debate to have, because I have a real problem with the whole concept of there being a nudge unit. Yeah. That once you go down the route of psychological manipulation, then you kind of link it to some of the other things that we've talked about how power corrupts. and suddenly you want to use it more and more and more, and you start to do it in ways that are not necessarily so beneficial for the population. So for me, it's such a complex topic.
Yes.
But it's probably best we save that one for another day.
Of course. And I was just thinking along the lines though, Rod, that you said about psychological manipulation, but don't we as individuals, not all the time, but whenever we're in company, in social context, we are psychologically manipulating those people around us, often without even knowing that we're doing it. Well, in a whole range of ways.
So I think that probably is true, but now you're getting right down to the most basic elements of human communications and so on, and what we're trying to achieve, when we're just having a chat with our friends and family and our children and so on. So it may well be true that a lot of the time we're doing a subconscious manipulation of people, and quite obviously some people are doing a less subconscious manipulation of other people, and so on. But I would kind of separate that from the government having the right to actually employ psychologists in the nudge unit.
Of course. An example when we talked about the questioning orders, and I don't know if you remember going back a decade, possibly 2 decades, at time flies. Do you remember the discussions about the Liverpool pathway? And what that effectively was where they increased the dosage of morphine to relieve pain, but also knowing full well that it hastened death in patients that had terminal illnesses. So they were controlling the end point. Now, what you then had, of course, was you basically had the doctor who told the nurse to up the morphine. The nurse then upped the morphine, and as a direct result, the patient died 24 hours later, as of say 2 weeks later. Whistleblowers then came out and said, this is what's going on. However, we know full well that it's still going on. And the reason it's going on is because they're making a decision between the fact that they know this person is going to die, but they're trying to alleviate the amount of pain that they experience when they're alive. So that in itself becomes an ethical dilemma. And if you bring that information to the public without giving them the actual experience and the actual full understanding of the process, then the public themselves could end up with a contorted conclusion that doesn't reflect necessarily the best interests of the patient.
So I think you're absolutely right. So I think, unfortunately, sort of medical science is full of ethical dilemmas. And one of the things about my work is I try and actually avoid the really complex ethical dilemmas because they're really difficult to explain in a beginner's guide. Yes. There are so many layers and nuances and so on that actually it requires a lot of detail. Yeah. And you kind of need to do it in a sort of discussion setting where you go through possibilities and outcomes and so on. And so in terms of medical ethics, it's not something that I've really researched. It's not something I have a strong opinion on. I think the whole point about a lot of these ethical things is you can actually make a strong argument in a number of different directions, and not everyone is going to agree. Whereas the strange thing is,
can I say the point I was trying to make more here was the role of the whistleblower, because it's back to the courtroom. Unless the whistleblower provides full access to all information to allow, within a democratic process, the audience to have that information and then make an informed decision, it's possible that you end up skewing the audience in a particular place that actually does not reflect reality.
Oh, well, so I haven't taken on board that your focus was on whistleblowers. So
sorry.
I'm actually a great sort of supporter of the ideas that whistleblowers should try and to make as much information available as possible. And you're absolutely right that if partial information is released, then sometimes that can present a very distorted view. I think ultimately sort of whistleblowers sort of end up being in a situation where they can only release whatever information they're able to release. They don't always have access to all the information. And so sometimes it's going to be released in a way that may lead people to only have an incomplete understanding of these things. But I think if our kind of media and education systems were much more like the sorts of thing that we would like them to be, then you could end up having sophisticated, complex debates about these things, and everybody could participate in those debates and so on. And the additional information could be sought from other sources and so on.
As long as the people participating, i.e. the audience within a democracy, have the skill set and the knowledge and the understanding in order to fully participate. And well, there again goes back to your idea about the solution being education and the Socratic way of asking questions. But until we have a sort of a revolution of the learning processes within this country, which will take a long time to encompass the vast majority of people, we are effectively stuck where we are. So is it, sometimes you could ask the question, by democratizing where at the moment, it may well do more harm than good, unless we put everything else in place.
So I would never say that democratizing things does more harm than good, but I am aware in the past they used to have a lot of discussions about the reintroduction of the death penalty. And if you do a kind of vox pops with the population, you'll probably find that about half or maybe slightly more than half of the people would like the death penalty reintroduced. But they've done research where they found that if you actually take people for a weekend and get lots of experts presenting all sorts of evidence to them about the death penalty, at the end of that weekend, the vast majority of people are against the death penalty. Now, of course, you could argue that that rather depends on the experts you put in front of them to present evidence and so on.
Yes, yes.
So the problem is we always operate with imperfect knowledge. And so you can never have perfect knowledge in any society, for any individual, and so on. There are always limitations. And so democracy just has to be about doing the best we can in terms of people's available knowledge and trying to make them as informed as possible and so on. But we always face weaknesses. And of course, this was always the argument of people like Winston Churchill, that too many decisions are too important to trust to the people. And I rather disagree with that. I think that actually, in general, if you give large numbers of people information and the opportunity to sort of influence decisions, then a lot of the time they might make reasonably wise decisions. I don't say that's a universal thing. I don't say it's on every topic. And I don't say it's necessarily with every sort of sample that you might choose. But I think actually, people would tend towards creating a fairer society. And so even on topics where you never see any mainstream discussion, so let's say you talk about prison sentencing. It's not a specialist area of mine, but I am very aware that in some countries, Scandinavian countries particularly, they have much less onerous prison sentencing systems. And in some countries, only a tiny handful of people go to prison and everybody else is left out in the community, and they do rehabilitation and so on. And I think actually, if you could discuss these things widely with lots of people, probably the vast majority of people would prefer a more humane, more enlightened prison system for most prisoners. So I actually believe in what some people call the wisdom of crowds. Not perfect wisdom or perfect knowledge by any means, but I think actually if we try to implement democracy much more honestly, where you have an informed population that has oversight of our elected representatives, I think we could come up with far better systems than we have now.
And I entirely agree with you. I think my main problem is that, I mean, let's take, for example, the Russian Revolution. Trotsky argues that revolution is permanent, that you are constantly having to adapt to given situations, you're constantly having to learn, and that it will never end. Whether he's right or whether he's wrong, that's what he believes. If you take your example, for example, of Sweden, and I don't know enough detail, but what I do know about Sweden is it's got a very small population and a very big landmass. So going back to the Milgram, what they're able to do with offenders is to remove them from the public consciousness, because they have so much space in order for them to go and do things that are visible to the people, whereas we don't. So it's very difficult to take, especially with our prison system and the way it works, unfortunately, and the numbers, it's very difficult to suddenly say, right, we're going to split off our prison sentence down the middle, 50%, and we're going to say, instead of them going to prison now in the court system, they're going to be doing community service, because they're wearing these black jackets and they're really obvious to the people. The people haven't been educated. Yeah, and they haven't. I mean, another example, Rod, is let's, for example, instead of the death penalty, which is fairly cut and dry, because a lot of people return to say, you know, I'm not God, therefore have no decision, no right to take somebody else's life. But let's look, for example, with the country being in a depression, the UK being in an economic depression, and they announce that they've just done a massive trade deal with Saudi Arabia. And part of that trade deal, which they don't fully disclose, is a lot of parts that go together to make arms, which the Saudis are then going to use against the Yemenis. So you've got a lot of complex issues here, some of which are being purposefully hidden, that have to be brought out into the public consciousness. But at the same time, the public consciousness is very aware that they are in an economic depression. They are struggling from hand to mouth on a day-to-day basis. And actually, they've just done this $100 billion deal, £100 billion deal that's going to bring a lot of money into the communities to be invested in public services. It may well be that even knowing full well, which is probably unlikely, but even knowing full well that these bits are going to be used to create these armaments, which are then therefore going to take many lives in Yemen, they're still going to sacrifice those people, as we talked about in the past with Adam Smith and the idea that if a Chinese person, etc., they may still say that their decision is to let the Yemenis people suffer instead of us.
So,
I know it's a convoluted thing, but in terms of psychology, I think what we need to do is get across to the viewer that psychology is such a complex thing, and there's so multiple ethics as well, and the amount of knowledge and understanding that we require, that in order to get to a society that we believe should exist, it's going to be a long road, and any quick fixes could actually make the situation worse.
There's always the possibility that any quick fix introduces sort of unintended consequences and so on. And I agree that the process is a kind of long, slow haul, unfortunately. I think there's a problem with trying to examine this type of thing with kind of like a thought experiment. So the Saudi Arabian trade deal that you mentioned, in that what tends to happen is people kind of, unfortunately, this is the way our education system and our media system have worked for the last God knows how many years. It's either an this or a not this, or it's a this or that. And in fact, of course, if you're talking about trade with any other country, then you can break any trade deal up and say, well, we need the important parts, but we don't have to do the torture equipment or the weapons. And so in fact, it's about helping people understand that situations are not simple A or B kind of dichotomies. It's actually about saying, look, we probably could come up with a reasonable solution for this, but we'd have to examine it in detail and so on.
Right, which means you'd need the knowledge. You'd also need large amounts of your population to be in desperate situations, which unfortunately depressions and economy brings. And you'd need them to believe that actually people in Yemen are equally of value to your children and your partner.
So that's all true. But say the thing is, if it's presented as a trade-off between British people and people in Yemen, that's the sort of thing that the mainstream media do. And that's the sort of thing that we need to try and avoid doing, because it's never a trade-off between people here and people in Yemen. That actually we can ensure that the Saudis are not harming people in Yemen, and we can do what we need to do here to make sure that people aren't in dire straits. And the two are not directly connected.
No, absolutely.
But politicians and the media will go out of their way to try and make them connected. So in fact, I think we need to try and do everything we can if ever we come across these thought experiments, to say, listen, that's not how the real world works. In fact, that's just the way the media and the politicians to kind of dupe you into thinking that you have to make unpalatable choices. But I think most of the time, that's not the case. I think with medical ethics, it's the case sometimes. But I think with most other situations, particularly in terms of economics, it's not, the real world doesn't really look like that. But the other thing that I think is worth stressing is that in terms of the economic, financial, political, corporate structures that we'd have to change, if we had politicians such as Jeremy Corbyn in power able to bring about change, making the necessary changes, in practice is not that hard. And there's always the chance, of course, that the American government will try to overthrow Jeremy Corbyn if he tries to introduce really serious changes. But in terms of changing the system of lobbying, it's not that hard. Changing the system of revolving doors between government and corporation, it's actually quite easy to do, and so on and so on. So it's about understanding that we have a lot of things to talk about, and getting the right politicians into power is incredibly difficult. And to do that, we need to change the education system. But actually, the decisions that need to be made are kind of no-brainers. You know, it's a bit like saying Jeremy's basic policy on foreign policy was, let's try and avoid invading other countries if we possibly can. And that's something that nearly everyone would agree with. And so to me, it's actually straightforward in that sense.
It is, and I won't labour the point anymore, because as you say, it's very complex. But obviously from philosophy, again, you have what called, you know, the Kantian categorical imperative, where a lot of people who deal with morality try to simplify it, and they try to say it is either this or this. So to completely radically overhaul the society in which you live, so it's no longer about just a binary dichotomy, would take a long time and a whole process by which we reorganize humanity and have an education system that's not instrumentalist in any way in terms of just delivering employees into the economy. So it means taking down effectively the whole capitalist system first before we can get to that point. And I totally understand, relatively speaking, what you say about Jeremy Corbyn. He was a beacon of hope, but he would have only have had 4 to 5 years. And unfortunately, the machinations of hierarchy and bureaucracy would have enabled him to do not nearly as much as we would have wanted him to do. And therefore, all those external forces, as you've implied, battering against him, a bit like Clement Attlee, 45 to 51, would mean that eventually probably the establishment would regain control, because we hadn't had the time to deliver or change the institutions that we needed to change in order for people to be much more optimistic.
So that may be a sort of pretty accurate description of what would happen. But so along with that, though, you have to say we must never give up, because once we give up, you know, we are destined to a terrible future of ever increasing inequality and so on. So yeah, we have to keep working and keep believing that one day we may find ways to educate the population and bring about the sort of changes that we would like to see.
Absolutely. But it's also why hope and reality need to get into bed together and consummate, because if they don't, what we're responding to is something that we've made up in our heads. So we have to deliver to the population their reality as much as we have to deliver to ourselves our reality. Because if so much is subjective, one of the major obstacles psychologically is to get the message across to people who don't want to receive it, as you talked about a lot in your presentation. And another example as well, I don't know if you're aware, but with the Qatar World Cup coming up next year, they brought in hundreds of thousands of people from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Indonesia to do the work. And then what they've done is they took away the passports of those people so they couldn't just flee back when they saw the working conditions in which they were in. And every day for most of them was about living 2 hours away, being bussed in to do the construction work, and then being bussed back 7 days a week. So it's a 4-hour round trip, plus all the hard, arduous work that they did as construction. A lot of them have died, and The Guardian did a big report on this 2 or 3 years ago. So the information has been coming out to a significant amount of the population. But how many of those people who read it, know it, will sit down and enjoy the Qatar World Cup and have put all that out of their heads? And that in itself, psychologically, is a very concerning thing too.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And that's this kind of distance thing, that it is very, very easy for an ordinary person in Britain just to completely switch off to all the detail of what's going on anywhere else in the world. And I think this is one of the things that we'll talk about quite a lot later on in the series, where we talk about the international economic system, that life for an awful lot of people all around the world is pretty awful. And it's not that way by accident. You know, these are conscious decisions made by powerful people. And that's powerful people in those countries, but also powerful people internationally. And it would be nice if we could find ways to get more people in Britain to kind of try and think about the international economic system. So various people try over the years, you know, there'll be a documentary about how the coffee system is exploitative, or the cotton system is exploitative, and so on. Or there'll be a thing about Apple subcontractors working in terrible conditions in another country. And these occasionally sort of get into the mainstream, but I don't think they ever really get into the consciousness of the majority of the population. And there's a conscious effort by powerful elites and by big companies particularly to kind of separate what goes on in other countries and what is driven by big companies and what happens here. And I think, you know, we need to find all sorts of ways to help people join the dots and help them to understand that actually our actions do have an impact on people overseas, and making their lives better is not that difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's about the size of the audience. I mean, like them or loathe them, the only mainstream newspaper that I ever allow myself to engage with is The Guardian, because even though their recent history is pitiful, they do still have some really good articles in there. And the trouble is, you come across these articles and you look at the number of people that read The Guardian on a daily basis, and it's minimal compared to the number of people that read the gutter press.
Yeah.
But you just hope, you know, you just sort of look at this thing as, oh, if only this could be in the Sun, the Express, the Mail, the Star, or whatever. And everybody was reading it, and everybody was engaged with it, and everybody had the skill set to make sense of it. But of course, they don't. So even if you mention it to people, it's just knowledge to you that you've acquired. But if you mention it to people, they don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Because they haven't been given the opportunity to engage in it or the skill set. So in itself, it's extremely frustrating.
So can I just say on that point, one of the things we do occasionally sort of suggest is that, to me, the hope lies with the younger generation, that actually I think they are wanting to be more engaged, or many of them are wanting to be more engaged and more critical. And in that sense, I think there is hope. Whereas to some extent, I have slightly written off most of the older generations, in that it'll just be too difficult for them in a large scale to overcome their existing conditioning and views.
Yes, yeah, no, that's a fair point. I don't know if you've come across Max Weber, and he talks about.
I haven't read much of his work.
Okay, well, one of the things he talks about is the charismatic personality, and how important the charismatic personality can be in winning over small groups, medium groups, and sometimes extremely large groups. And we see this through religion, we see it through cults, and we certainly see it through politics, where people, people that you wouldn't expect, normal working class people who love Boris Johnson. Yeah. And he has absolutely nothing in his life that's any representation to these individuals. He just knows what to say. He's been told what to say. He's learned what to say for it to be appealing, even though it's purely lip service. So we've also got that problem, haven't we, psychologically, in that people are very susceptible to being won over by people who aren't informing them with accurate knowledge, but are just, as you talked about earlier, saying the things they want to hear.
Yeah, I think that's an enormous problem. And I think Boris Johnson is sort of the ultimate example of somebody who goes out of his way to portray himself as this bumbling clown, whereas behind the scenes, you know, he's very savvy and he's doing things in a particular way, and people do fall for this. And, you know, so he'll make an appearance on Have I Got News for You? And it'll be a legendary performance and everybody will be talking about it. But he knows exactly what he's doing, you know. And I think this is a problem, because people like me and other sort of critics of the system tend to play it very straight. And it is very, very difficult to know what to do. It's quite interesting. One or two comedians who have slots on TV sometimes, at different points in the past, they have tried to do critical political shows, and they run for half a dozen episodes late at night. I don't think many people watch them, and then they get cancelled. And it's extremely difficult to know kind of how to break that barrier.
Yes. So there's a methodology, I guess, that you could make quirky normal, in which case us being straight would be the cool. Okay, I'll go on quickly now. Interesting, just picking up on a point here, you talked about day centres, and you talked about this social obligation for parents to get there for 3:30 in order to pick their child up. But I guess you could also argue that there's, and it's going back to the fear thing that you mentioned, the fear of the impact it could have on the way in which the people who run the daycare centre perceive your child, and you, to a lesser extent, if you're constantly late, and the way in which it affects, as I say, it impacts upon that perspective.
Yeah, I'm sure there are loads of sort of complex psychological things going on. It would be very hard to separate that out, in the sense that you would expect that would still exist to some extent if you introduce a fee system. From the point of view of the people who work at the centre, their lives are still the same, and you would assume it's the management who've introduced the fee, and it may not affect the sort of staff. So in that sense, it would still be at play. So there'll be all sorts of complex additional factors that you could bring into this discussion.
Of course, I mean, if you didn't have any money and somebody said for every 15 minutes that you're late, we're going to charge you a tenner, you're going to be there on time, aren't you?
Yeah.
But if you're driving around in a 7 Series BMW and you have a 10-bedroom house and a swimming pool, the chances are that £10 for being 15 minutes late is neither here nor there. But the chances you sending your children to the same place in the first place are pretty remote. Something else as well, you talked about Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair is an absolutely amazing writer, and he was writing around the beginning of the 20th century, and his books are extremely revealing about the conditions that people in New York and in California were living in. And it also links in, I think, to what you were talking about in terms of division of labor and outsourcing, because when you have the Fordist approach that was adopted, where the production line and people stopped, for example, in terms of cars, they stopped taking responsibility for building the whole thing and having the whole skill set to build the whole thing. And now all they needed to do was a very small atomized part of it, which sometimes could have just meant putting the wheels on like that, all for the whole shift. But it also meant that when the car left the factory, and let's say out of however many cars that left the factory in a given period of time, 50% of them, the brakes failed, it meant that nobody else on that production line had to take responsibility for the brakes failing, apart from the people that put the brakes in.
Yeah.
And of course, the people who tested the car at the end of it who didn't pick up on it. So what it does, you're absolutely right, what it's done is, instead of you going into the thing thinking that you're wholly responsible for this product, and you want to make sure that the product is best as possible, so that not only doesn't it hurt anybody else, but it doesn't come back to you. Whereas now we have a process by which, I don't know what percentage of the people fit the brakes, but let's say 10%. The other 90% can hold their hands up and say, nothing to do with me, Gov. So that psychologically has a massive impact too, doesn't it, in the workplace?
I'd have to sort of study that as a kind of production line phenomenon. It's not something I've researched, but I think the general thing about responsibility definitely does about not having responsibility because of the way we structure our workplaces probably does have an effect in many places.
Yes.
I'm really sorry. It's just come to 1:30. We're going to have to wind it up.
Yes, yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah, that was it for me. I was about to say thank you, Rog. Yeah, no, thank you yet again. It was, fascinating in terms of the psychology, fascinating discussion. And again, just to finish off, what I really want to do is motivate people to think. Sure. It's not about us sitting here and saying, this is it. You must remember when you engage in these 10x6s and these discussions with Rod, that you go away and you think about it for yourself. Brilliant. Have a great week, Rod, and I'll see you next week.
You too. Yeah, see you next week. Cheerio.